Before there was a Zulu empire, there was a king who almost made sure it never existed. Before the world learned the name Shaka, it already knew a different name, spoken with fear from the Pongola River to the shores of Delagoa Bay, a name that made chiefs surrender their cattle without a fight, and mothers hide their children at the sound of approaching drums. That name was Zwide Kalanga. He was not a footnote in Shaka Zulu's story. For over a decade, he was the story, the most powerful king in the land that would one day be called Zululand, a ruler who broke kingdoms the way other men broke spears. And when he finally met his match, the war between them didn't just decide who would rule a stretch of southern African hills. It shattered a region, scattered its survivors across a continent, and gave birth to nations that still exist today in South Africa, in Eswatini, in Mozambique, in Malawi, in Zambia, in Tanzania. So why do so few people know his name? Why is he remembered, when he is remembered at all, only as the man Shaka defeated, a stepping stone in someone else's legend? This is the story history left in the shadows, the story of the king who built an empire before Shaka built his, the king whose fall triggered the Mfecane, the great scattering that remade an entire subcontinent. This is the story of Zwide Kalanga, his rise, his rule, his war with Dingiswayo, his war with Shaka, and the defeat that neither he nor anyone else in southern Africa ever saw coming.
To understand Zwide, you first have to understand the world that made him. At the turn of the 19th century, the land between the Drakensberg Mountains and the Indian Ocean, what would later become known as Zululand and Natal, was not one kingdom. It was a patchwork of dozens of small Ngoni-speaking chieftains, each ruled by its own Nkosi, each measuring its wealth in cattle, its power in the strength of its young men. For generations, conflict between these chiefdoms had followed familiar, almost ritual patterns: cattle raids, boundary disputes, skirmishes settled with a handful of casualties, and a return to the status quo. It was a world of tradition, not conquest. Then the ground began to shift beneath it. Southern Africa was gripped by a series of devastating droughts stretching back to the late 1700s, and by the first decades of the 1800s, famine had tightened its hold on the region so severely that oral tradition still remembers it by name, the Mhlatuze famine, a Zulu phrase that roughly translates to "eat and keep quiet," a bitter description of hunger so total that people ate whatever they could find and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Grazing land shrank, grain stores emptied, and as the old ways of surviving stopped working, communities began fighting one another for what little remained. At the same time, a very different kind of pressure was building on the coast. Portuguese traders operating out of Delagoa Bay, in the region of modern-day Maputo, had created a market for ivory, cattle, and captives, and control of the trade routes leading to that market was becoming a new and valuable form of power. A chief who controlled those routes didn't just have cattle, he had influence that could reach beyond his own borders. Drought pushing people together in desperation, trade pulling ambitious men toward the coast. Old systems of small, loosely connected chiefdoms no longer able to cope with either pressure. Out of that instability, larger, more centralized, more militarized kingdoms began to rise. Kingdoms built not on tradition, but on the ability to absorb, to conquer, and to hold power by force. Historians studying this period point to three men who emerged from the chaos as the dominant powers of the region: Sobhuza of the Ngoni, who would eventually be pushed north to lay the foundations of what is now Eswatini; Dingiswayo of the Mthethwa, a shrewd and unusually strategic leader who built his power through alliance and absorption; and a third man, ruling a Ngoni clan called the Ndwandwe, also known by their clan name, the Insumalo. His name was Zwide Kalanga, and for a time he would outbuild them both.
Zwide was born around 1758, the son of Langa Kakaba, chief of the Ndwandwe. When Langa died around 1805, Zwide inherited the Ndwandwe chieftaincy, and with it,
a kingdom sitting in one of the most dangerous positions in the region, wedged between rival powers, its territory desirable, its neighbors ambitious. Some rulers in his position might have chosen caution. Zwide chose expansion. Under his rule, the Ndwandwe grew from a regional chieftaincy into the most feared military power in the land. Like his rival Dingiswayo, Zwide restructured his fighting men into age-based regiments, amabuto, young men grouped not by family but by age set, trained together, deployed together, loyal to the king rather than to individual clan heads. This was part of a broader military transformation happening across Ngoni society in this era, as chiefdoms under pressure militarized to survive. But few rulers pursued it as ruthlessly or as effectively as Zwide. His method for growth was direct and brutal. Any chief who resisted him faced attack, and the survivors, their warriors, their cattle, their households, were absorbed directly into the growing Ndwandwe nation. Chiefs who saw what had happened to their neighbors often chose submission over destruction. It was, in its own violent way, a highly effective strategy for building an empire quickly, and by the 1810s it had made Zwide the dominant power of the northern Nguni world. His capital stood at Magudu Mountain, south of the Pongola River, in the heart of what remains Zwide's ancestral homeland to this day. And standing beside him, shaping his strategy at every turn, was a figure who has become almost as legendary as the king himself, his mother, Ntombazi. Oral tradition remembers Ntombazi as an Inyanga, a healer and diviner of formidable power, a woman whose reputation for sorcery struck fear into rival kingdoms. Some traditions go further, describing a macabre collection of skulls belonging to defeated enemy kings, kept as grim trophies of Ndwandwe supremacy. How much of this is literal history, and how much is the kind of legend that grows up naturally around a feared and powerful royal house, is genuinely difficult to say with certainty. This is oral tradition passed down through generations, not a contemporary written record, and it should be understood that way. What historians agree on with more confidence is this: Ntombazi was no passive royal mother. She was one of Zwide's closest and trusted advisors, a political force in her own right, deeply involved in the strategic decisions that built and expanded the Ndwandwe state. Together, mother and son built a kingdom that by the second decade of the 19th century had no equal in the region, except for one.
To the south, Dingiswayo's Mthethwa confederacy was growing along a different path. Where Zwide expanded through conquest and absorption, Dingiswayo built his power increasingly through alliance, drawing smaller clans into a confederation under his protection rather than simply crushing them outright. It was within this Mthethwa world that a young outcast prince found refuge, the illegitimate son of a minor Zulu chief, exiled with his mother Nandi and mocked for his uncertain parentage. His name was Shaka Zulu. Under Dingiswayo's protection, Shaka rose through the Mthethwa ranks, and by most accounts it was here, not among the Zulu, that his ideas about warfare first began to take shape. Shorter stabbing spears in place of long throwing ones, tighter formations, closer and more decisive combat. When Shaka's father died in 1816, Dingiswayo backed his claim to lead the small Zulu clan, and the Mthethwa king and his rising Zulu protege became close allies, their warriors fighting side by side against a common rival. That rival was Zwide. For years, the two dominant kings of the region, Zwide of the Ndwandwe and Dingiswayo of the Mthethwa, circled each other in an escalating contest for supremacy. Zwide used strategic marriage alliances to extend his influence, even marrying one of his daughters to Sobhuza, the Ngoni king who would go on to found the Swazi royal line. But alliance meant little when it conflicted with ambition. When a land dispute arose between Zwide and his own son-in-law, Zwide attacked without hesitation, driving Sobhuza's people north into what is now Eswatini. By the mid-1810s, only one obstacle remained between Zwide and total dominance of the region: Dingiswayo himself. The details of what triggered the final war have been blurred by more than 2 centuries of oral retelling, but the outcome is not in dispute.
Sometime around 1817, in a clash between Ndwandwe and Mthethwa forces, Dingiswayo was captured, betrayed, according to tradition, by informers who revealed his position to Zwide's warriors as he was cut off from his main force. He was taken to Zwide's homestead, and there the Mthethwa king was put to death. It was without question the single greatest victory of Zwide's career, and it should have secured his supremacy over the entire region. Tradition holds that Dingiswayo's skull was added to Ntombazi's collection at the royal homestead, a final, chilling seal on the end of Zwide's greatest rival. With Dingiswayo dead, the Mthethwa confederacy that he had spent years building should have collapsed into chaos, its territory ripe for the taking. Instead, something happened that Zwide could not have predicted and could never fully undo. The grieving remnants of the Mthethwa did not scatter. They turned to the one man among them who had learned Dingiswayo's methods and pushed them further than even his mentor had imagined. Shaka, now installed as chief of the small Zulu clan under Dingiswayo's earlier patronage, absorbed the leaderless Mthethwa regiments into his own growing following. He gave them a new king, a new identity, and, grief hardening into purpose, a singular burning motivation to avenge the man who had raised him. Zwide had killed the mentor. In doing so, he had unleashed the student, and the student was about to prove himself the more dangerous man of the two.
By April of 1818, Zwide had had enough of the upstart Zulu chief who refused to submit. In his eyes, Shaka was still a minor irritation, the leader of a small clan that had inherited another king's followers, nothing more. So Zwide did what he had always done to defiant rivals. He sent an army to end the problem permanently. This was not a raid. It was an invasion meant to erase Shaka from the map entirely. Estimates of the Ndwandwe force vary across the oral record, with some traditions placing it as high as 12,000 warriors. Whatever the precise number, it dwarfed anything Shaka could field. He may have had as few as 5,000 men, including allied regiments. Command of the Ndwandwe army was given to Nomalanjana, Zwide's eldest son and heir, for as paramount king, Zwide himself did not lead his armies into battle. That was a role reserved for his sons and generals. A conventional battle fought on open ground against those numbers would have been suicide. Shaka understood this better than anyone, so he refused to offer Zwide a conventional battle at all. In the days before the Ndwandwe army arrived, Shaka's people stripped the surrounding countryside bare. Grain, livestock, anything that could sustain an invading force, gone. His civilian population and the bulk of his cattle were hidden away in the Mhlatuze River valley, safely out of reach. But he left one deliberate exception, a decoy herd, positioned near his royal homestead at Kwabulayoyo, close enough to tempt Zwide's commanders into dividing their forces to seize it. Then he chose his ground, a crest-shaped rise near the white Mhlatuze River known as Gqokli Hill, steep-sided, difficult to assault, with a hidden depression at its summit where he stationed reserves, supplies, water, and food, prepared for a prolonged defense. When Nomalanjana's massive army reached the river crossing, they found the ford too narrow to bring their full numbers to bear at once, a bottleneck that stripped away almost all of their numerical advantage. Wave after wave of Ndwandwe warriors pushed up the slopes of Gqokli Hill, and wave after wave broke against a tight defensive ring of Zulu shields and short stabbing spears. The terrain did what Shaka needed it to do. It forced the larger army to bunch together, turning their numbers into a liability instead of a strength. For hours under the open sun, the battle ground on, brutal, exhausting, inconclusive. And then Shaka played the move that would define the rest of his career. As the fighting wore the Ndwandwe down, part of Shaka's force staged a deliberate retreat, drawing a portion of Nomalanjana's warriors away from the main body of the fight in pursuit, straight into the open, straight into a trap. Concealed regiments swept out from the flanks and closed around them. It was, by most accounts, among the earliest large-scale uses of the tactic that would become the signature of Zulu warfare for a generation, the horns and chest formation, impondos and como, the horns of the buffalo,
a central force to hold the enemy's attention while flanking horns swept around to encircle them. The trapped Ndwandwe warriors had no way out. It was no longer a battle, it was a slaughter. Among the dead was Nomalanjana himself, Zwide's own son and heir, and oral tradition holds that several of his brothers fell alongside him that same afternoon. When the surviving Ndwandwe forces saw their commander cut down and their comrades encircled, their morale broke, and what remained of the invasion force retreated north across the river. Shaka had held the hill. He had lost warriors, by tradition a costly toll on both sides, but he had done what should have been impossible. He had stood against an army more than twice his size, and survived. Some later accounts even questioned whether the engagement of Gqokli Hill unfolded exactly as remembered, since so much of it survives only through oral tradition recorded decades afterward, a reminder that even the most vivid battle stories from this era pass through generations of retelling before they reach us. But whatever its precise shape, the outcome was not in doubt. Zwide's first attempt to crush the Zulu had failed, and it had cost him his own son. For Zwide, this was no longer a matter of politics, it was personal, and it demanded a reckoning.
The defeat at Gqokli Hill did not break Zwide's power. The Ndwandwe remained by far the larger and more established kingdom, but it planted something more dangerous than a military setback: humiliation, grief for a dead heir, and a rage that would not rest until the debt was repaid in full. For roughly 2 years, Zwide rebuilt. He gathered warriors from across his territory, absorbing more clans, reinforcing his regiments, assembling what oral tradition remembers as a truly massive army, by some estimates numbering in the tens of thousands. This time, there would be no improvised defense on a single hill to save his enemy. This time, Zwide intended to erase the Zulu kingdom completely. In late 1819 into 1820, he marched south, and Shaka, watching the scale of what was coming, understood immediately that Gqokli Hill could not simply be repeated. His kingdom was still young, he could not afford to trade lives, even in another costly victory, and he certainly could not survive a war of attrition against a force this size. So instead of meeting Zwide's army head-on, he did something that took extraordinary discipline and nerve. He refused to fight at all. As the enormous Ndwandwe army advanced into Zulu territory, they found nothing waiting for them. Villages stood empty, grain stores had been burned or hidden, cattle had vanished into the hills. Shaka had ordered a scorched earth withdrawal on a scale far beyond what he'd used at Gqokli Hill, pulling his people and his forces deeper and deeper into Zulu territory, refusing the decisive confrontations Zwide's commanders were desperate for, and instead wearing the invading army down with hit-and-run raids on its flanks before melting back into the bush. An army that size needed enormous quantities of food and water simply to keep moving. The land Shaka left behind provided almost none. Days stretched into weeks, Zwide's warriors grew hungry, exhausted, and increasingly demoralized, chasing an enemy that refused to stand and fight, while Shaka led them deliberately toward a river he knew intimately, the Mhlatuze. He waited there, patient, for the moment the Ndwandwe army would have no choice but to cross. When it came, the massive Ndwandwe force began its crossing, slow, cumbersome, splitting the army in two, with one half already on the far bank and the other still fighting the current. It was, for a brief and irreversible window, completely vulnerable. Shaka struck. Rather than attacking the whole of Zwide's divided force, he threw his full army against the half that had already crossed, hungry, exhausted, and cut off from immediate support. The result was chaos. Encircled and unable to form disciplined battle lines, the Ndwandwe warriors on the near bank were overwhelmed by fresh, coordinated Zulu regiments fighting on ground of their own choosing. Those still on the far side of the river could only watch as their comrades were cut down, unable to reach them in time to help. The Mhlatuze itself became a barrier between rescue and slaughter. What had marched south as the most powerful army in the region collapsed within hours. It wasn't a battle any longer, it was a rout. Command structures shattered, famous regiments scattered in every direction, and Zwide, the king who had once dominated the entire land between the Drakensberg and the sea, was forced to flee for his life with only a remnant of his once vast following. Shaka's regiments did not stop at the river. They marched on into Ndwandwe territory itself and burned Zwide's stronghold to the ground. Tradition holds that in the destruction of the royal homestead, Ntombazi, the king's mother, his closest advisor, the woman whose reputation had once struck fear across the region, was killed and her legendary collection of enemy skulls destroyed along with her.
Whether every detail of that account is literal history or has been shaped by generations of retelling, its symbolic weight is unmistakable. It marked as clearly as any single event could the end of an era. The Ndwandwe kingdom, the dominant power of a generation, was gone. Its king was a fugitive. Its people were scattered to the wind.
What happened to Zwide in the aftermath is genuinely uncertain, and the historical record itself reflects that uncertainty rather than resolving it. Some traditions hold that Zwide fled north with a small remnant of loyal followers, crossing the Pongala River, eventually reaching as far as the upper Komati River region, where he lived out his final years in a much diminished exile before dying around 1825. Other accounts claim he was tracked down by Shaka's warriors and killed. His son, Sikunyana, is said to have carried his body back to Ndwandwe territory for burial on the sacred slopes of Magadu Mountain, the same mountain where his father, Langa, and other Ndwandwe royal ancestors were laid to rest, a final return to the land where his kingdom had first risen. The Zwide, who had once been called the most powerful man in the region, died not as a conquering king, but as a wanderer, stripped of the empire he had spent 2 decades building.
Here is the part of Zwide's story that most retellings leave out entirely, and it may be the most consequential part of all. The collapse of the Ndwandwe kingdom did not simply end quietly, it detonated. The destruction of the region's dominant power, arriving on top of years of drought, famine, and rising militarization, triggered a chain reaction of displacement and war across the whole of southern Africa, a period of upheaval that would come to be known as the Mfecane, the crushing, or in Sesotho, the Difakane, the scattering. Historians continue to debate exactly how much of this transformation should be attributed to the fall of the Ndwandwe specifically, and how much was already in motion from drought, population pressure, and the pull of trade at Delagoa Bay. But there is little dispute that Zwide's defeat was one of the decisive sparks. Zwide's own kingdom did not vanish, it scattered, carried outward by his surviving generals who refused to kneel to the new order Shaka was building in the south. Soshangane, one of Zwide's most capable commanders, led a large body of Ndwandwe survivors northeast, out of Shaka's reach, into what is now southern Mozambique. There, drawing on the very military and political structures Zwide had pioneered, he built an entirely new kingdom, the Gaza Empire, absorbing local Tsonga and Shona communities, and at the height of its power, even compelling Portuguese coastal settlements to pay him tribute. The Gaza state would endure for decades, and the Shangaan people of the region today trace their name and identity directly back to him. Zwangendaba, another of Zwide's generals, led his own following on one of the most extraordinary migrations in African history, journeying north for more than 1,000 miles over the course of roughly 2 decades, crossing the Zambezi River in 1835 in a crossing oral tradition remembers as coinciding with a solar eclipse. His people became known as the Ngoni, and after his death, his successors established powerful Ngoni states across what is today Malawi, Zambia, and Tanzania, carrying the military traditions born under Zwide's rule thousands of miles from the land where they began. And there was a third figure whose path ran directly through Zwide's court, though his greatest fame came later. Mzilikazi, son of Mashobana, chief of the Khumalo clan, watched his father killed on Zwide's orders when the Ndwandwe overran Khumalo territory. Mzilikazi initially served within the world Zwide had built, before eventually breaking away to seek refuge with Shaka's rising Zulu kingdom, and from there, following his own falling out with Shaka years later, he would lead his own following north to found the Ndebele kingdom in what is now Zimbabwe. 3 kingdoms, Gaza, the Ngoni states, and eventually the Ndebele nation, all tracing threads of their origin back through the ashes of Zwide's fallen empire. None of them would exist in the form they took without the war that destroyed the Ndwandwe. This is the part of Zwide's legacy that deserves to be remembered as clearly as his defeat. His fall did not erase his people, it scattered them like seeds across a continent, and those seeds took root as new nations that endure to this day.
History has not been especially kind to Zwide Kalanga. In the telling and retelling of Shaka's legend, he tends to appear only as an obstacle, the villain the hero had to overcome on his way to greatness. But that framing does something quietly unfair to the actual history. For close to 2 decades, Zwide Kalanga was the most powerful king in a land now remembered almost entirely for someone else's empire. He inherited a vulnerable chieftaincy wedged between hostile neighbors and built it through sheer ambition and often brutal force into the dominant power of the region. He defeated Dingiswayo, one of the most capable rulers of his generation. He came within a single river crossing of erasing the Zulu kingdom before it had properly begun. His downfall was real and it was total, but so was his rise, and so was the extraordinary unplanned legacy that followed his defeat, carried by his generals into Mozambique, into the highlands of Malawi and Zambia, into what is now Zimbabwe, becoming the foundation of nations that still exist today. Zwide Kalanga was not a footnote. He was a king in his own right, whose story deserves to be told with the same weight, the same detail, and the same respect as the man who ultimately defeated him. What do you think? Was Zwide's fall the true beginning of the Mfecane, or simply the spark that ignited forces already building beneath the surface? Let us know in the comments. If this hidden chapter of Southern African history moved you, subscribe for more deep, carefully researched dives into the kingdoms, wars, and rulers that colonial history spent generations trying to erase from memory. This is our history. It deserves to be told right.